I woke up to the sound of construction equipment grinding against frozen ground, and my first thought was that my neighbor had finally lost his mind and decided to expand his garage at 6 in the morning. I pulled on my boots and winter coat, stepping out into the bitter January cold that defined life in Vermont this time of year. My property sat on 20 acres just outside of Burlington, and the piece de resistance was the small creek that ran right through the middle of it. I had bought this place 3 years ago specifically because of that creek. It fed into the larger Winooski River system, and watching it flow through my backyard was the kind of peace money could not buy. Except now, there was an excavator parked right next to it. I trudged through the snow, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air, and spotted 3 men in orange vests working around what looked like some kind of structure being built directly over my creek. My creek, on my property. I felt my jaw clench as I approached, already knowing this had to be some kind of mistake. "Hey," I called out, waving my arms. "What the hell is going on here?" One of the men looked up, then pointed toward a woman standing near a white SUV. She wore a puffy cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my truck payment and held a clipboard like it was a scepter of power. Her blonde hair was styled in that particular way that screamed, "I need to speak to your manager," even from a distance. I changed direction and headed straight for her. "Excuse me, I am Ivan Quincy and this is my property. What are you doing here?" The woman looked me up and down with the kind of dismissive glance reserved for people who shop at outlet stores. "I am Barbara Hendricks, president of the Meadowbrook Community HOA. We are constructing a Deicer station for the community." I blinked. "The what now?" "A Deicer station," she repeated slowly, like I was hard of hearing. "The HOA board voted on it last month. The creek freezes every winter, and we need running water to keep the community de-icing fluid tanks filled. This station will pump water from the creek and heat it so it does not freeze in the lines." "Lady, I do not live in any community with an HOA. This is private property." Barbara smiled the way a shark might smile at a particularly slow seal. "Actually, when you purchased your home, you also purchased a portion of the Meadowbrook Community Development. The previous owner was a member of our HOA, which means you inherited that membership." "That's insane." "I never signed anything about an HOA." She pulled a sheet of paper from her clipboard and handed it to me. It was a photocopy of some document with a lot of legal language. I recognized my property deed number at the top. "Page 47 of your closing documents. HOA covenant runs with the land. I suggest you familiarize yourself with our bylaws." She turned back toward the construction. "Now, if you will excuse me, we have work to complete. The station needs to be operational before the next storm system moves through." I stood there, cold seeping through my boots, staring at this woman who had just told me that not only was I somehow part of an HOA I never knew existed, but they were also building something on my land without my permission. "You cannot just build on my property without permission. The HOA has an easement for water access. It was established in 1987 when this land was first developed. You can read all about it in the covenants." Barbara checked her watch. "We will be done by Wednesday. Try to keep any pets away from the construction zone." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing in the snow with a piece of paper and a rage that threatened to melt the ice around me. I spent the rest of the morning in my home office, digging through every document from my house purchase. Sure enough, buried in the stack of papers I had barely glanced at during closing, there it was. A single paragraph on page 47 that mentioned the Meadowbrook Community HOA and something about ongoing covenants and restrictions. I called my real estate attorney, a guy named Tom who had handled the closing. "Tom, it's Ivan Quincy. I've got a situation. Ivan, hey, what is going on? I explained the construction, the HOA, and Barbara's claims about easements and covenants. Tom was quiet for a moment. Let me pull your file. Hold on. I heard papers rustling, keyboard clicks. Okay, yeah, I see it here. There is an HOA covenant attached to your property. The previous owner, Gerald Mitchum, was part of the original development back in the 80s. When subdivisions were created, the HOA was formed for the whole area. But I do not live in a subdivision. I have got 20 acres and the nearest house is half a mile away. Right, but your property was part of the original parcel that got divided up. Some people built big estates like yours. Others built smaller homes. The HOA was supposed to manage shared resources like the creek access and some of the roads. Tom, they are building something on my land without my permission. That is where it gets complicated. If they have a valid easement for water access, they might have the right. But I would need to see the exact language of the easement and the HOA bylaws. Can you scan and send me everything? I spent the next hour scanning documents and emailing them to Tom. By the time I finished, the construction crew had already set concrete footings for what looked like a small building right next to the creek. The structure was maybe 10 feet by 12 feet, with PVC pipes already being fitted to connect to the water. My phone rang. Tom. Ivan, I have reviewed the documents. The easement does grant the HOA access to the creek for water usage. However, the construction of permanent structures requires property owner notification and approval. They needed to give you at least 30 days' notice and obtain your written consent. They did not do any of that. Then they are in violation. You can file for an injunction to stop the construction. But here is the thing, it will take time to get a court date, probably weeks. By then, they might have the station finished. So what do I do? Document everything. Take photos, videos, keep records of all communications. File the injunction Monday morning. I will draft it today. In the meantime, do not physically interfere with the construction. That could open you up to liability. I thanked him and hung up, feeling frustrated. The law was supposed to protect property owners, but it seemed like the HOA could just bulldoze ahead, literally, and I had to wait for the legal system to catch up. The construction continued through the weekend. By Sunday afternoon, the Deicer station was nearly complete. It was a small metal building painted in beige, with a heating unit inside and pipes running directly into my creek. The setup included a pump that would pull water from the creek, heat it, and send it through underground pipes to various locations throughout the Meadowbrook community, where residents could fill containers with warm water for de-icing their driveways and walkways. It was actually an impressive system, if it was not completely illegal and sitting on my property. Monday morning, I met Tom at the courthouse in Burlington. We filed the injunction, and the clerk said we would likely get a hearing date within 3 weeks. 3 weeks. The station would be operational long before then. What if I just turn it off? I asked Tom as we walked back to our cars. Do not touch it. Seriously, Ivan. That is destruction of property and the HOA will sue you into next year. Let the legal process work. But I could not let it go. This was my land. My creek. I had moved here to get away from the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that organizations like HOAs represented. The whole point of buying 20 acres in Vermont was to not have some board of busybodies dictating what I could do with my property. That evening, Barbara showed up at my door with 2 other people, a man and a woman, both looking like they shopped at the same expensive outdoor clothing store. Mr. Quincy, we need to discuss your HOA dues, Barbara said without preamble. I am not paying any HOA dues. You are required to pay quarterly dues of $850. You are currently 3 years in arrears, which means you owe $10,200, plus late fees and interest. Your total comes to $14,600. I laughed. Actually laughed. You have got to be kidding me. The man, who introduced himself as Richard Pemberton, vice president of the HOA, stepped forward. This is not a joke, Mr. Quincy. The previous owner failed to inform us when he sold the property. We only discovered you were the new owner when we filed the paperwork for the Deicer station construction permit with the county. I am not paying you $14,000. I do not use any HOA services. I do not attend your meetings. I did not even know you existed until you started building on my creek. The woman, Deanne Sheffield, treasurer, spoke up. The debt exists regardless of your awareness. If you do not pay within 30 days, we will place a lien on your property. Get off my land. Barbara's smile was cold. The Deicer station becomes operational tomorrow. We expect your payment by February 15th. Good evening, Mr. Quincy. They left, and I stood in my doorway, watching their taillights disappear down my driveway. The audacity was breathtaking. Not only had they built on my property without permission, now they wanted me to pay them thousands of dollars for the privilege of being harassed. I called Tom again. They cannot just demand payment like that, can they? Unfortunately, if the HOA covenant is valid and you are technically a member, then yes, you owe dues. The amount seems high, but HOAs can charge whatever their bylaws stipulate. The lien threat is also real. They can put a lien on your property for unpaid dues. This is insane. Welcome to HOA law. It is designed to give the associations a lot of power. Your best bet is to fight the validity of the covenant itself. If we can prove you were not properly notified of the HOA membership during the sale, we might be able to void it. Might. Property law is complicated, Ivan, but I will do everything I can. That night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about that Deicer station, humming away on my property, pumping water from my creek. It felt like a violation, like someone had reached into my life and taken something that was not theirs to take. The next morning, I walked down to the creek to see the station in operation. Sure enough, I could hear the pump running, and warm water was flowing through the pipes. The creek itself looked normal, but I knew that pump was pulling hundreds of gallons per day from the flow. I followed the pipeline through the woods. It ran underground for about a quarter mile before reaching the edge of the Meadowbrook community proper, where homes were spaced on 1-acre lots in a development that looked like it had been built in the early 90s. The pipeline connected to several filling stations, basically outdoor spigots with heated tanks where residents could fill buckets or tanks with warm water. As I stood there, a woman came out of one of the nearby houses with a large container. She filled it from the spigot, steam rising into the cold air, then waved at me cheerfully before heading back inside. She had no idea the water was coming from my property, from my creek, without my permission. I walked back home, mind racing. Tom had told me not to touch the station, but what if I did not touch the station itself? What if I just exercised my rights as a property owner to control water flow on my land? The creek on my property was fed by a natural spring about 100 yards upstream from where my land started. The water flowed down through a small gorge, creating a picturesque waterfall before leveling out and running through my property. During the winter, parts of the creek froze, but the flow was usually strong enough to keep water moving. But what if I redirected the flow? I spent the afternoon researching water rights in Vermont. The laws were complex, but essentially, I had riparian rights to the creek since it flowed through my property. I could not completely stop the water from flowing to downstream properties, but I could make reasonable use of it on my own land. including redirecting it for agricultural or personal purposes. An idea began forming. The next day, I drove into Burlington and met with a different attorney, specializing in water rights. Her name was Patricia Stone, and she had a reputation for being aggressive and thorough. "Tell me the situation," she said. I explained everything from the HOA's sudden appearance in my life to the Deicer station to the demand for back dues. Patricia took notes, nodding occasionally. The HOA overstepped. Building without your explicit written permission is a clear violation, easement or not. The dues situation is trickier, but I think we can fight that too. However, you said you are interested in water flow control. Is it legal for me to redirect the creek on my property? For what purpose? I was thinking of building a pond, maybe for irrigation or fish farming. Something that would require me to temporarily divert the creek flow. Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying me. You want to cut off the water to their Deicer station. I want to make use of my property rights. She smiled. I like it. Here is what you need to know. You can divert the creek for reasonable use on your property. The key word is reasonable. If you completely dam the creek and cut off all downstream flow, you will get sued and you will lose. But if you divert water for a legitimate purpose, temporarily reducing flow, that is within your rights. Especially during winter when water usage for things like a Deicer station could be considered non-essential. How do I do this legally? You file for a stream alteration permit with Vermont DEC. Explain you are creating a pond or water storage system for agricultural use. It will take a few weeks to get approved, but once you have that permit, you are golden. In the meantime, document everything the HOA is doing. I paid Patricia a retainer and left her office feeling like I finally had a plan. The HOA wanted to play games with property rights and legal technicalities. Two could play that game. I filed the stream alteration permit application the next day, stating I wanted to create a half-acre pond on my property for potential aquaculture. It was not a lie. I had actually thought about raising trout before. The fact that creating this pond would require diverting the creek, temporarily reducing flow downstream, was just a side effect of my legitimate business plans. While I waited for the permit, I continued documenting the Deicer station's operation. I took photos, videos, measured the water flow, and recorded the pump's operating hours. The thing ran constantly, pulling water 24 hours a day. I estimated it was using at least 500 gallons per day, maybe more during peak times when multiple residents were filling their containers. Barbara sent me a certified letter demanding payment of the HOA dues. I had Tom send a response denying any obligation and citing the lack of proper notification during the property sale. She sent another letter threatening legal action. Tom responded with our injunction filing and a counter-claim for trespassing and illegal construction. The legal volleys went back and forth for 2 weeks. Then my stream alteration permit was approved. The permit allowed me to construct a pond not exceeding half an acre in surface area, with appropriate spillway and drainage to maintain minimum downstream flow of 30% of current creek volume. 30%. That meant I could legally divert 70% of the creek's water for my pond project. I hired a local excavation company, the same one that had built my driveway when I first moved in. The owner, a guy named Mike, remembered me and was happy to take the job. "You want a pond right here?" he asked, standing near the creek about 50 yards upstream from the Deicer station. "Right here, half-acre, 8 feet deep at the center, sloping sides. I want it done in 3 days." Mike scratched his head. "That is fast, but we can do it. What about the creek flow?" "I need you to build a temporary diversion. Channel most of the water into the pond. Leave just enough flowing downstream to meet the permit requirements. You got a permit for this. I showed him the paperwork. He read it carefully, then nodded. Okay, but I've got to warn you, whoever is downstream is going to notice a big drop in water volume. That is kind of the point. Mike grinned. I do not know what is going on here, but I like your style. The excavator arrived the next morning. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees, and the weather forecast called for a cold snap, with nighttime temperatures falling below zero for the next week. Perfect timing. Mike and his crew started digging. The excavator's bucket bit into the frozen ground, slowly carving out what would become my pond. Simultaneously, they built a temporary berm to redirect the creek flow into the excavation. Within hours, water began pooling in the growing pit, and the flow downstream toward the Deicer station dropped to a trickle. I watched from my back porch, drinking coffee as the creek that normally ran fast and full became a weak stream barely 6 inches wide. The temperature was dropping as the sun set, and I knew what would happen overnight. That trickle was going to freeze solid. My phone rang at 8:30 that evening. Unknown number, I answered. Mr. Quincy, this is Barbara Hendricks. What have you done to the creek? Hello, Barbara. I am building a pond, agricultural purposes. You cannot do that. You are cutting off the water supply. Actually, I can. I have a permit from Vermont, DC. Would you like me to email you a copy? This is deliberate sabotage. This is property improvement. The fact that it affects your illegal Deicer station is unfortunate but incidental. I could hear her breathing, heavy and angry. You are going to regret this, Mr. Quincy. The HOA will sue you for damages. Get in line. I am already suing you for trespassing and illegal construction. Have a good evening. I hung up and poured myself a bourbon. Outside, the temperature display on my deck thermometer read 12 degrees and falling. By morning, the reduced creek flow had frozen completely. I walked down to inspect and found a beautiful scene. The creek was a ribbon of ice, with only the faintest dampness showing where water had been. The Deicer station's pump was still running, but it was pulling air now, making a sick grinding sound. I took photos and videos, careful to document that there was still some water seeping through. I was meeting my permit requirements. Just barely. Several Meadowbrook community residents showed up by mid-morning. They stood at the edge of my property, staring at the frozen creek and the dry filling stations. One man, wearing an expensive-looking ski jacket, started walking toward me. Stay off my property, I called out. You froze the creek. We need that water. You need to take it up with your HOA. They built that station without my permission. Now they can deal with the consequences. This is insane. People need to de-ice their driveways. Use salt like everyone else in Vermont. Barbara arrived an hour later, this time with a sheriff's deputy. My heart rate spiked, but I reminded myself I had done nothing illegal. The deputy, a young guy named Officer Martinez, approached me. Mr. Quincy, that is me. Madam here says you have illegally cut off the water supply to a community service station. The station was built on my property without my permission. I am building a pond and I have a permit. I showed him the paperwork. Officer Martinez read the permit carefully. This looks legitimate. Barbara practically hissed. He is deliberately sabotaging the Deicer station. Madam, if he has a permit to alter the stream, that is within his property rights. You would need to take this up in civil court. But people need that water for de-icing driveways. The officer looked skeptical. That is not exactly an essential service. Folks can use salt or sand. Barbara turned red. This is harassment. Officer Martinez closed his notepad. I do not see any criminal activity here. Like I said, this is a civil matter. He nodded to me and walked back to his patrol car. Barbara stood there, shaking with rage. "You have not won, Mr. Quincy. Not by a long shot." She stormed off, and I returned to watching Mike's crew work on the pond. The excavation was nearly complete, and the pond was filling nicely with the diverted creek water. Once it was full, I would build a proper spillway to maintain the required downstream flow, but that would take another week or two. In the meantime, the Deicer station sat silent and useless, its pipes frozen solid. The next development came 3 days later. The HOA filed an emergency motion in court, seeking an immediate injunction against my pond construction. They claimed I was interfering with their easement rights and causing damage to community infrastructure. Tom and Patricia, my 2 attorneys, prepared a vigorous defense. We appeared in court before Judge Ellen Morrison, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who had a reputation for cutting through legal nonsense. Barbara's attorney, a slick-looking guy named Crawford Mills, argued that I was deliberately sabotaging the HOA's legal water access. "Your Honor, the defendant has maliciously redirected the creek to cause damage to community property. This is not a legitimate agricultural project. This is revenge." Patricia stood. "Your Honor, my client has a valid stream alteration permit from the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation. He is operating entirely within his legal rights as a property owner. The fact that the HOA chose to build their Deicer station without his permission, in violation of proper notification requirements, is not his problem." Judge Morrison looked at the permit, then at the photos of the Deicer station. "Counselor Mills, did your clients obtain written permission from Mr. Quincy before building on his property?" Mills hesitated. "The HOA has an easement for water access." "That is not what I asked. Did they get written permission?" "The easement grants them access rights." "I will take that as a no." Judge Morrison looked at Barbara, who sat behind Mills looking furious. "Miss Hendricks, is it correct that you built a permanent structure on Mr. Quincy's property without obtaining his explicit written consent?" Barbara stood. "Your Honor, the HOA has operated under its easement rights for decades." "Answer the question. Did you get written permission?" "We believe the easement was sufficient authorization. Belief is not the same as legal permission." Judge Morrison shook her head. "I am denying the HOA's motion for an injunction. Mr. Quincy has a valid permit and is operating within his property rights. The HOA's claims regarding easement access will need to be litigated properly, but I am not going to halt a legitimate agricultural project based on what appears to be the HOA's own failure to follow proper procedures." She banged her gavel. "Next case." We walked out of the courthouse into the cold February afternoon. Patricia was grinning. "That went better than expected." "What happens now?" I asked. "Now they will probably sue for damages to their equipment. The pump might be damaged from running dry. They will try to claim you owe them for repairs and loss of service." "Let them try." Tom spoke up. "Our injunction hearing for their illegal construction is scheduled for next week. If we win that, we can potentially force them to remove the station entirely." Things got quiet for a few days. The pond was finished, a beautiful half-acre of water that would actually be great for fishing once it warmed up. I built a spillway that maintained the minimum required downstream flow. It was not much, maybe 30% of the original volume, but it was enough to keep me legal. The creek downstream stayed mostly frozen because of the reduced flow and the ongoing cold snap. The Deicer station sat idle. Then the letters started. I received 36 letters from Meadowbrook community residents, all complaining about the lack of Deicer water. Some were polite, asking if there was any way to restore the flow. Others were hostile, accusing me of being a bad neighbor and threatening various forms of retaliation. One letter stood out. It was from a woman named Olivia Foster, and unlike the others, it was sympathetic. Dear Mr. Quincy, I am writing to apologize on behalf of the Meadowbrook community. Many of us had no idea the HOA built that Deicer station on private property without permission. Barbara Hendricks has run this HOA like her personal fiefdom for years, and most residents are too intimidated to challenge her. Your property rights should have been respected. I hope you understand that not all of us support what was done. Sincerely, Olivia Foster. I appreciated that letter. It reminded me that most people were decent. It was the Barbaras of the world who caused problems by thinking rules did not apply to them. The injunction hearing arrived. Tom presented our case. The HOA had built a permanent structure on my property without providing required notification or obtaining written permission. We had documentation showing I had never been contacted about the project until construction was already underway. Mills tried to argue that the easement provided sufficient authorization, but Judge Morrison was not having it. The easement grants access to the water, not permission to build permanent structures. Those are two entirely different things. Mr. Quincy should have been notified at least 30 days in advance and given the opportunity to approve or deny the construction. Since that did not happen, the construction was unauthorized. She looked at Barbara, who sat stone-faced. The HOA is ordered to remove the Deicer station within 30 days, or Mr. Quincy is authorized to remove it himself and bill the HOA for costs. It was a complete victory. Barbara tried to appeal, but her attorney advised her the appeal would almost certainly fail and cost more money. The HOA board held an emergency meeting, which I learned about from Olivia Foster, who sent me occasional updates. Apparently, there was a major rift forming in the community. Many residents were angry at Barbara for the legal losses and the expenses, which would have to be covered by increased HOA dues. The Deicer station remained frozen and inoperative. A few residents started questioning why they needed it in the first place, since they had managed for years with regular salt and sand. The station had been Barbara's pet project, something she had pushed through despite lukewarm support from the community. As the 30-day deadline approached, the HOA made one last attempt at negotiation. Barbara, along with Richard and Deanne, showed up at my door. "Mr. Quincy, we would like to discuss a compromise," Barbara said. Her tone was different now, less imperious, more careful. "What kind of compromise? If you allow us to keep the Deicer station in place, we will waive all back dues and remove your property from the HOA covenant." I considered it. Having the HOA out of my life was appealing. But the station was a symbol of their overreach, and I did not want it on my property. "No deal. Remove the station, and then we will talk about removing my property from the HOA." Richard spoke up. "The station cost $40,000 to build. We cannot just tear it down." "You should have thought about that before building it without permission. You have 3 weeks left." They tried to negotiate further, but I held firm. Finally, they left, and I felt good about standing my ground. This was not about being difficult. It was about principle. They had violated my property rights, and now they had to face the consequences. 2 weeks before the deadline, something unexpected happened. The local newspaper, the Burlington Free Press, ran a story about the HOA dispute. Apparently someone, probably Olivia Foster based on the inside details, had contacted a reporter named Sarah Chen, who specialized in property rights issues. The article was titled HOA Overreach, When Community Rules Collide with Property Rights. It detailed the entire saga, from the unauthorized construction to the court rulings to the frozen Deicer station. Sarah had interviewed me, Barbara, and several Meadowbrook residents. My quotes were straightforward. I had bought property to enjoy privacy and natural resources, only to be ambushed by an HOA I did not know I was joining, and then have them build on my land without permission. Barbara's quotes were defensive and tone-deaf. She kept talking about community needs and how I was being selfish by not cooperating. The residents Sarah interviewed were split. Some supported Barbara and blamed me for being difficult. Others, like Olivia, thought the HOA had overstepped and I was right to fight back. The article went viral locally. Within days, I was getting calls from other property owners in Vermont who had their own HOA horror stories. A local radio station interviewed me. Someone started a Facebook group called Vermont Property Rights that accumulated hundreds of members discussing HOA overreach. The attention put pressure on Barbara and the Meadowbrook HOA board. At their next meeting, which was apparently contentious, a motion was introduced to recall Barbara as president. The vote was close, but she survived barely. However, the board did vote to remove the Deicer station. They could not afford the negative publicity or the potential for further legal costs. A different excavation company showed up at my property to dismantle the station. I watched as they tore down the small building, pulled out the pump and pipes, and hauled everything away. The concrete pad remained, but I was fine with that. I could build something on it later, maybe a shed or a gazebo. Once the station was gone, Patricia negotiated the removal of my property from the HOA covenant. It required the HOA board to vote and agree, which they did unanimously. They wanted me gone as much as I wanted to be gone. The legal documents were finalized in early March. I was officially no longer part of the Meadowbrook Community HOA. I owed no dues, had no obligations, and they had no claim to my property or my creek, but the story was not quite over. In April, I received a subpoena. The state of Vermont had opened an investigation into the HOA's handling of funds. Apparently, the Deicer station construction had been paid for using HOA dues, but the project had never been properly approved by a vote of the membership. Several residents, led by Olivia Foster, had filed complaints alleging financial mismanagement. I was called to testify about the construction timeline and my interactions with Barbara. The investigation revealed that Barbara had essentially authorized the project unilaterally, claiming it was an emergency infrastructure improvement that did not require a membership vote. However, the HOA bylaws clearly stated that any expenditure over $10,000 required a full membership vote. The $40,000 Deicer station definitely qualified. Additionally, investigators found that Barbara had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, including dinners, travel, and even a portion of her country club membership. She had disguised these expenses as community outreach and board business, but the records did not support her claims. In June, the state filed charges against Barbara for misappropriation of HOA funds and fraud. Richard and Diane were also charged as accessories, since they had signed off on many of the questionable expenses as vice president and treasurer. The local news covered the story extensively. Barbara tried to defend herself, claiming she had always acted in the community's best interest, but the evidence was damning. She had treated the HOA like her personal bank account for years. The trial was scheduled for September. In the meantime, the Meadowbrook Community HOA elected new leadership. Olivia Foster became the new president. She reached out to me personally to apologize again, and to assure me that the new board would respect property rights and operate transparently. I appreciated the gesture, though I was glad to no longer be part of their organization. The trial lasted 2 weeks. I testified about the unauthorized construction and Barbara's dismissive attitude toward my property rights. Other residents testified about questionable expenses and lack of transparency. The financial records spoke for themselves. The jury found Barbara guilty on multiple counts of fraud and misappropriation. Richard and Deanne were found guilty of lesser charges. Barbara was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $60,000 to the HOA. Richard and Diane received probation and smaller restitution payments. I watched the verdict on the news from my living room. It felt surreal. What had started as a dispute over a Deicer station had ended with criminal convictions. But in a way, it made sense. Barbara had not just violated my property rights. She had violated the trust of an entire community, using her position for personal gain and running the HOA like a dictatorship. The Deicer station was just the most visible example of her overreach. As fall arrived and the leaves changed color on my 20 acres, I sat on my back porch and watched the creek flow. My pond was full and beautiful, stocked with trout that rose to feed on insects. The water flowed over the spillway and continued downstream, feeding into the larger watershed that defined this part of Vermont. Life was peaceful again. The legal bills had been substantial, but Patricia had negotiated a settlement where the HOA paid my attorney fees as part of the agreement to remove my property from the covenant. Tom had done the same for his fees related to the injunction. I actually came out slightly ahead financially, though that had never been the point. Olivia Foster sent me a Christmas card that year. The HOA was running smoothly under new leadership, she wrote. They had dissolved the Deicer program entirely, and residents were just using regular salt and sand like they always had before Barbara's grand idea. Dues had been reduced. Meetings were well attended and actually productive. The community was healing. I appreciated the update, though I had no desire to rejoin. My experience had reinforced why I had moved to Vermont in the first place: to be left alone, to enjoy my property, and to not deal with petty bureaucrats who thought they had power over me. The creek flowed. The pond teemed with fish, and my 20 acres remained mine, truly mine, without any HOA strings attached. On New Year's Eve, as snow fell softly outside, I poured a bourbon and toasted to property rights, to standing your ground, and to the importance of fighting back when someone tries to take what is yours. The Deicer station was gone. Barbara was in prison, and my creek was free. It had been one hell of a year. The following spring brought new growth and a sense of renewal. The legal drama was behind me, and I could finally enjoy my property the way I had always intended. I built a small dock on the pond and spent weekends fishing for the trout that had grown fat over the winter. The creek maintained its steady flow, providing that constant soothing sound that had attracted me to the property in the first place. But living in a small community meant that my reputation had preceded me. People in Burlington knew me as the guy who had fought the HOA and won. Some viewed me as a hero, standing up against bureaucratic overreach. Others thought I was difficult and unneighborly. I did not particularly care either way. I had done what I needed to do to protect my property rights. One afternoon in May, I was working in my garden when a truck pulled up the driveway. I tensed for a moment, old reflexes from the HOA battle kicking in, but relaxed when I saw it was Mike, the excavation contractor who had built my pond. "Hey, Ivan, got a minute?" Mike called out as he climbed out of his truck. "Sure, what's up?" I have been getting calls from property owners all over the state. People who heard about what you did and are dealing with their own HOA problems. Some of them need ponds built. Others just need advice on how to fight back legally. I was wondering if you would mind if I gave them your contact info. Not to bother you, just if they want to hear your experience. I thought about it. Part of me wanted to say no, to maintain my privacy and distance from other people's drama. But another part remembered how alone I had felt when Barbara first showed up with that excavator, how overwhelming it had been to suddenly face an organization I did not even know I was part of. Yeah, okay. Give them my email. I cannot promise I will help everyone, but I can at least share what I learned. Over the next few months, I received dozens of emails from Vermont property owners dealing with HOA disputes. Each story was different, but the themes were similar: overreach, lack of transparency, arbitrary rules, and HOAs that seemed more interested in control than in actually serving their communities. I shared my experience with each person who reached out. I recommended Patricia and Tom as attorneys. I explained about property rights, water rights, and the importance of documentation. Some people just needed to vent. Others were gearing up for their own legal battles. One case particularly interested me. A man named Gerald Morrison, no relation to Judge Morrison, owned property in Rutland where his HOA was trying to force him to remove a solar panel array because it was aesthetically inconsistent with the community character. Gerald had installed the panels before the HOA passed the restriction, but they were claiming the rule could be applied retroactively. I connected Gerald with Patricia, who took his case. The situation was similar to mine in that the HOA was trying to assert power it did not actually have. The case went to court, and Patricia successfully argued that retroactive rule enforcement violated Gerald's property rights and the HOA's own bylaws. Gerald kept his solar panels. These small victories felt good. It was not that I enjoyed conflict, but I believed strongly in property rights, and the idea that people should be able to use their land as they saw fit, within reason, without some board of busybodies interfering. By summer, the legal community in Vermont had started paying attention to what some were calling the HOA property rights movement. A few legislators even proposed a bill that would require HOAs to follow stricter notification procedures before taking action against property owners, and would limit their ability to place liens for minor violations. The bill had not passed yet, but the conversation was happening, and that felt like progress. Meanwhile, my life returned to a comfortable rhythm. I worked remotely as a software consultant, which gave me flexibility to enjoy my property. I fished in the pond, hiked through my woods, and watched the seasons change. The creek flowed steadily, never freezing completely even in the coldest part of winter, because I maintained good flow and did not have a Deicer station pulling hundreds of gallons a day. In August, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Barbara Hendricks, written from the correctional facility where she was serving her sentence. The handwriting was neat, almost obsessively so. Dear Mr. Quincy, I am writing to apologize for my actions and the distress I caused you. During my time here, I have had the opportunity to reflect on my behavior as HOA president. I allowed my desire to improve the community to override my respect for individual property rights. I should have contacted you before building the Deicer station. I should have listened when you objected. Instead, I let my pride and sense of authority cloud my judgment. I understand that you were instrumental in the investigation that led to my conviction. While I am angry about my circumstances, I recognize that I brought them on myself through poor decisions and misuse of community funds. I hope you can forgive me, not for my sake, but so you can move forward without anger. Sincerely, Barbara Hendricks. I read the letter several times. Part of me wanted to tear it up and throw it away. Barbara had made my life miserable for months, had violated my property, and had shown no remorse until she was facing prison time. But another part of me recognized that holding on to anger would only hurt me. Barbara was facing the consequences of her actions. She had lost her freedom, her reputation, and her role in the community she had tried to dominate. My grudge would not make any of that worse for her or better for me. I wrote back a short response. Barbara, I accept your apology. I hope you use this time to genuinely reflect and grow. What you did was wrong, but people can change. I wish you the best in that process. I sent the letter and felt a weight lift. The whole situation had taught me a lot about standing up for myself, about property rights, and about how systems of power can be abused when there is not proper oversight. But it had also taught me about forgiveness and letting go. As autumn approached again, marking more than a year since the excavator had first appeared on my property, I hosted a small gathering. I invited Olivia Foster and a few of the Meadowbrook residents who had supported me. I invited Mike and his crew. I invited Patricia and Tom, my attorneys who had fought so hard on my behalf. We gathered around the pond, grilling burgers and drinking beer, watching the sun set over the water. Olivia gave a toast to Ivan for reminding all of us that property rights matter, that individuals have power, and that standing up to bullies, even bureaucratic ones, is always worth it. Everyone raised their glasses. I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the alcohol. These people, most of whom I had not known a year ago, had become friends through shared struggle and eventual triumph. As the evening wore on and people started to head home, Olivia pulled me aside. I have been meaning to tell you something, she said. The new HOA board voted to dissolve the Meadowbrook Community HOA entirely. We are forming a much looser neighborhood association with no mandatory dues, no enforcement power, just a group of neighbors who help each other out when needed. It is what an HOA should have been all along. That is great, Olivia. I am happy for you all. We could not have done it without your fight showing us what was possible. Barbara had everyone convinced the HOA was untouchable. You proved it was not. After everyone left, I sat alone by the pond, listening to the night sounds. Frogs sang their evening chorus. The creek burbled over the spillway. An owl hooted from somewhere in the woods. This was what I had wanted when I bought this property. Peace, connection to nature, and freedom to live on my own terms. The battle with the HOA had threatened all of that, but in fighting back, I had not only protected my rights but had also helped others protect theirs. The Deicer station was gone, demolished and hauled away. The creek flowed free. My pond teemed with life, and I was finally, truly home. Winter came again, as it always does in Vermont. The temperatures dropped, snow fell, and the landscape transformed into a frozen wonderland. The creek kept flowing, never freezing completely thanks to the steady current and the natural thermal properties of the spring that fed it. I stood on my back porch one cold December morning, coffee in hand, watching steam rise from the pond. The water was cold but not frozen, maintained by the flowing current and the depth I had excavated. A year and a half had passed since Barbara had first appeared with her excavator and her clipboard. 18 months of legal battles, stress, and uncertainty. But also 18 months of growth, of learning to stand up for myself, of understanding that property rights were not just abstract legal concepts but fundamental protections against overreach. My phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Patricia. Thought you would want to know. Barbara was released early for good behavior. She is out on parole. I felt a momentary tension, old instincts preparing for renewed conflict. But then I relaxed. Barbara was no longer HOA president. She had no power over my property or my life. She was just another person trying to rebuild after making serious mistakes. If she had learned from her time in prison, good for her. If not, that was her problem, not mine. I finished my coffee and went inside to start my workday. The sun climbed higher, melting the frost on the windows. The creek flowed steadily, its sound a constant reminder of why I loved this place. In the months that followed, life continued its steady rhythm. I expanded my garden in the spring, planting vegetables and herbs. I stocked the pond with more fish. I built a small greenhouse to extend the growing season. My 20 acres became more than just property. They became a true homestead, a place where I could be self-sufficient and connected to the land. The emails from other property owners dealing with HOA issues slowed to a trickle. Either there were fewer disputes, or people had found other resources. Either way, I was happy to return to a quieter existence. One warm day in June, almost 2 years after the Deicer station fiasco began, I was fishing from my dock when I heard a car coming up the driveway. I reeled in my line and walked around to the front of the house. It was Barbara Hendricks. She looked different than I remembered. Thinner, with more gray in her hair and wearing simple jeans and a t-shirt instead of her expensive outdoor gear. She stood by her car, not approaching the house, clearly nervous. "Mr. Quincy," she called out, "I hope it is okay that I came by. I wanted to speak with you in person." I walked toward her but kept some distance. "What can I do for you, Barbara? I wanted to thank you for your letter. It meant a lot to me during a very difficult time." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I also wanted to see the pond, the one that started everything." I studied her for a moment, trying to gauge her intentions. She seemed genuine, but I had been fooled by her confidence before. "Okay," I said finally. "Come on." I led her around the house to the pond. She stopped at the edge, taking in the peaceful scene. The water was clear, reflecting the blue sky. Fish rose occasionally to snap at insects. The spillway created a gentle sound as water flowed back toward the creek. "It is beautiful," Barbara said quietly. "I understand now why you fought so hard. This is your home, your peace. I had no right to violate that." "No, you did not." I spent a lot of time thinking in prison about why I acted the way I did. I think I was so focused on being important, on being the person who made things happen in the community, that I forgot the community was made up of individuals with their own rights and needs. I turned the HOA into a tool for my ego instead of a service for neighbors. I nodded, but said nothing. This was her confession to make. "Anyway, I am working as a bookkeeper now. Boring work, but honest. I am trying to rebuild my life and make amends where I can. I know I can never fully repay the HOA for the money I misused, but I am making payments. And I wanted to apologize to you again in person for everything I put you through." "I appreciate that, Barbara." She turned to face me. "Do you think people can really change?" "I think people can grow if they are willing to be honest with themselves. Whether that is the same as changing, I do not know, but you seem different than the person who showed up here with an excavator and an attitude." Barbara smiled sadly. "I am trying to be." We stood there for a moment longer, then she thanked me again and walked back to her car. I watched her drive away, feeling a strange sense of closure. The battle was truly over, not just legally, but emotionally. Barbara had been the antagonist in my HOA nightmare, but she was also just a person who had made bad choices and was now trying to do better. I could respect that. As summer turned to fall, and the 2-year anniversary of the original conflict approached, I reflected on everything that had happened. What had started as a simple property rights dispute had spiraled into criminal charges, community upheaval, and a broader conversation about HOA power in Vermont. The bill that had been proposed to limit HOA overreach finally passed the state legislature. It required HOAs to provide 60 days' notice before taking any action against a property owner, mandated annual financial audits, and limited their ability to place liens without court approval. It was not perfect, but it was progress. I like to think my fight had contributed to that change, even if only in a small way. My pond remained my favorite feature of the property. I spent countless hours there, fishing, reading, or just sitting and thinking. The Deicer station was a distant memory, visible only in the old concrete pad that I had eventually turned into a patio area with a fire pit. The creek flowed as it always had, unimpeded and free. I maintained my spillway to ensure adequate downstream flow, but I used plenty of water for irrigation and to keep the pond full. It was a balanced system, one that respected both my property rights and the needs of the broader ecosystem. One late October evening, I built a fire in the pit on the old concrete pad. The flames danced in the darkness, casting flickering shadows across the pond. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and coming winter. I thought about all the people who had been part of this journey. Patricia and Tom, who had fought for my rights in court. Mike and his crew, who had built the pond. Olivia Foster, who had helped reform the HOA. Even Barbara, who had unwittingly taught me about standing firm in the face of pressure. And I thought about all the property owners across Vermont and beyond who were dealing with similar issues, fighting their own battles against overreaching HOAs and arbitrary rules. The fire crackled, sparks rising into the night sky. The pond reflected the flames, creating a mirror of light and warmth. The creek sang its endless song. This was home. Not just the land, not just the buildings, but the principle of it. The right to live as I chose, to make decisions about my own property, to be free from unwarranted interference. That right was worth fighting for. It had always been worth fighting for. And sitting there by the fire, on the concrete that had once supported an unwanted Deicer station, on property that was fully and completely mine, I knew I would fight for it again if I ever had to. But I hoped I would not have to. I hoped the lessons learned from this battle would prevent future ones. I hoped Barbara's conviction and the new state laws would make HOAs think twice before overstepping their bounds. I hoped, but I stayed ready. Because that is what you do when you have something worth protecting. You enjoy it, you appreciate it, and you stay ready to defend it. The fire burned down to embers. The night grew colder. I headed inside, leaving the pond and creek to their peaceful existence, knowing they would be there in the morning and all the mornings after, flowing free on my land, under my care, protected by rights I had fought to preserve. The Deicer station was gone. The HOA was gone from my life. And I was home, truly home in every sense of the word. That was how it ended. Not with dramatic confrontation or explosive finale, but with quiet victory and hard-won peace. Sometimes the best endings are the ones where you simply get to go back to living your life the way you always wanted to, undisturbed and free. And that was exactly what I got.